This is the story of Martin Flight 495. On the 21st of December 1992, a Martin DC-10 was flying from Amsterdam Schipol Airport to Faro Airport in Portugal. The plane had 327 passengers and 13 crew members on board. Since the flight was so close to Christmas, the plane was full of Dutch holidaymakers. But unfortunately, the passengers couldn't expect a smooth ride that day. The weather over Faro was bad. Before takeoff, the captain examined satellite images of Faro, and it showed a low-pressure area in the Atlantic. Strong winds and storms would greet them as they flew into Faro that day. But as the plane was about to depart, an issue with the number 2 thrust reverser delayed the flight by 40 minutes. But once that was fixed, the plane took off from Schipol at 4:52 a.m. UTC. Soon, the plane was cruising at 37,000 feet as planned. This was a short flight, just 2.5 hours long, and it's quite surprising that they went with a widebody for such a short flight. A few hours after being in the air, the plane was closing in on Faro Airport. At 7 a.m., the pilots were going over the approach to Faro. They talked about the runway and the navigational aids that they would use to get the plane on the ground. As the plane got closer to the runway, the pilots had their eye on the fuel level. 12 tons of fuel, it read. More than enough fuel to attempt a landing and then divert if needed. Their diversion airport was Lisbon, and the captain double-checked if their diversion was still viable. It was, and everything was set for this landing. At 7:14 a.m., the captain gets word from the ground, and it's bad news. The weather is very bad. It looked like they might have to divert to Lisbon if the weather was this bad and did not improve. The pilots turned to the weather radar, and it too did not show them good news. There were showers to the west and south of the airfield. As they got closer to the airport, they listened into the conversation between another plane. From their conversation, the pilots got to know that what they identified as a simple shower system was actually a thunderstorm system. As they descended into the thick of it, the plane was jostled around by the turbulence. The turbulence didn't let up for the remainder of the flight. Even as they were turning onto final, the plane was still being hit by pretty strong winds. In the cockpit, the pilots were blind. The plane flew into one cloud and then into another. Since rains had been battering the airport, the controllers told the pilots that the runways were flooded and that they should report when the airport was in sight. The pilots knew that the plane could handle a bit of water on the runway, so they decided to continue the approach to the runway. As the gears dropped, the runway was in sight, and this looked like any other landing in a storm. This was a challenging approach, but nothing that a few trained pilots could not handle. When the plane was 800 feet above the ground, the controller asked the plane if they could see the runway. They reported that they had the runway in sight. The pilots struggled with winds gusting to 20 knots as the plane descended. At 7:32 a.m., the first officer exclaimed, "Pappy," referring to the lights that let the pilots know if they were on the right glide path. But the captain was fighting his own battles. He said, "Speed a bit low, speed is low." At this point, the windows iced up, and the first officer said, quote, "Windshield anti-ice, I don't see anything." As all of this was happening, the captain was still trying to keep the plane at the right height and at the right speed. He said, "A bit low, a bit low." As the pilots fought to keep the plane under control, the speed of the plane started to drop, and the pilots did not notice. As the plane descended, it started to rock from side to side. The right wing dropped, then the left wing dropped. The pilots were trying their best to fight the oscillations. The radio altimeter said 50 feet. The captain had enough and called for throttles. On the CVR, you could hear the throttles being advanced. But despite that, the plane touched down on the runway very hard. The forces on the plane were well in excess of what the plane was designed for. The captain pulled back on the yoke in an attempt to take the plane back into the air. But the go-around fell through. The plane banked towards the right, and the wing made contact with the runway. As the weight of the plane came down on the wing, it snapped. The plane skidded through the airport for a few hundred meters before flipping over and bursting into flames. 56 people did not make it. Now, this is a very hard video to do because there are just so many different versions of what happened. For example, there's a Dutch version of events, there's a Portuguese version of events, and then in 2011, a more detailed forensic study was done at the behest of a few of the family members. For this video, I will be going with the English translation of the Dutch report. I would have gone with the 2011 report, but that's not from a governmental agency, it's from a private firm. So let's stick with the investigators. After the crash, when looking into the data, the investigators found that the plane was oscillating quite a bit as it came into land at Faro. They knew that the source of these oscillations had to be one of two things. The oscillations could be a result of the automation, or it could be a result of the plane being hit by winds stronger than anyone expected. The thing is, no one had told the pilots about the possibility of wind shear, and no one had reported it up until that point. Wind shear is basically the wind just changing direction for a short bit of time. It can really throw a wrench into the works if you're landing. But with storms so close, an experienced captain would have been on the lookout for the telltale signs of strong winds or wind shear. The data recorder readout showed that the plane was being hit by strong winds as it came down. As per regulations, if the plane isn't stabilized for a landing when it is below 500 feet, then the captain must go around. But in the case of Flight 495, the rate of descent varied by a lot. And by a lot, I mean a lot. For example, the rate of descent varied from 100 feet per minute all the way to 1300 feet per minute. If the pilots did not arrest this high rate of descent, then it is possible that the landing gear would be overwhelmed by the sheer force of a landing like this. No landing gear is designed to take the force of such a hard landing. Looking at the wind data, they found something even more interesting. As the plane passed over the threshold of the runway, it was hit by a 40-knot crosswind. The thing is, this was very near what the plane was rated to handle, and the winds were much stronger than what the controllers had reported. It was right at this time that the pilots did something that they really should not have done. They pulled back power on the engines, essentially ensuring that the plane would be touching down hard on the runway. The reasons for this are not that clear, but the report says that the plane passed through a rain shower right as it passed over the threshold. This might have caused a visual illusion, which caused them to believe that the horizon was lower than it was, prompting them to cut power to the engines. But that could not have come at a worse time for Flight 495, as it just made the plane drop even faster onto the runway, overwhelming the right-hand landing gear, causing it to collapse. Another thing that was working against them was the rain itself, but not in the way that you would expect it to. The water droplets would stick to the wing for a bit and disrupt the airflow, so if the rain was heavy enough, then the rain could cause a perceptible reduction in lift, causing the plane to drop even faster. So with Flight 495, there were a confluence of really weird circumstances. The winds were stronger than anyone expected. The pilots pulled power way too early. The plane landed on the right-hand landing gear. There was a visual illusion that confused the pilots. And finally, the rain was taking away some of the lift that they had. It was a perfect storm, in more ways than one. The weird thing is that this landing should not have been attempted in the first place. Sure, the plane was unstable below 500 feet. That was reason enough to go around. But apparently, since it was raining so badly, the water on the runway would have increased the landing distance by so much that the DC-10 would not have been able to stop on the runway. Something that the investigators circled back to was the fact that the pilots disabled the automation in the last phase of flight, and they flew the plane down manually. Some say that that was a causal factor in the accident. But what do you think? Do you think that them flying the plane manually played a part in this accident? Do let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. It will really help the channel grow. I will catch you guys next time. Stay safe.